Hello, I'm Jessica Shankleman. I'm a journalist from Bloomberg News covering climate change, and I'm joined here today with climate change data supremo Emily Shuckburgh and also Steve Bowen, who has the coolest job title in the world, Head of Catastrophe Insight at Aon. I'm really looking forward to hearing more, Steve, about what you can tell us about catastrophe and how we can prepare for it, because the last couple of years have taught us a lot about how much we need to prepare for that. So we're here to talk today about insurance, Emily, and insurers have been grappling with this issue for a really long time. How do they insure against climate change, whether that's here in the UK, insuring against flooding, or in California to insure against wildfires? Can you talk us through the risks that they face?
Yeah, so I mean, the key thing about climate change, of course, is that numbers in terms of the global average temperature rise sound relatively small. 1 degree Celsius doesn't sound like a very large number, but of course it translates into a very large increase in the risk of extreme weather events. And we've been seeing that over the last few months with floods or wildfires affecting communities around the world. And so one thing that's critical for insurance is to understand that changing risk profile and then to be able to factor it into their insurance products. But additionally, I think the other thing that's we're really starting to recognise is the cascading risks associated with that. So where those physical risks of climate change then interact either with each other or with other risks, societal risks, for example, or perhaps risks in terms of food or water security. And so trying to understand those interconnected risks and how those then affect aspects that you might be wanting to insure is also really critically important to understand.
Okay, great, thank you. So Steve, how do we adapt these catastrophe models to take account of the changing climate science?
Sure. So this is one of the big challenges that catastrophe models currently face. I mean, historically, these have been models that are taking historical events and basically looking backwards and trying to trend to today. So the big challenge is starting to adapt climate change research and recalibrate these models to basically start having a forward-looking view. The big challenge is trying to show the comparisons of today's conditions and looking at what future conditions may look like. We also know that there are, not just the challenges around the hazard and how events are going to be differently, but it's also how we're building, what that future exposure is going to look like, and ensuring that we're taking into account the way people are building and trying to ensure that they're doing it a bit more smartly, and trying to really hone down on the communication aspect so people really understand what they could be facing, and not just the near term, but also in the long term as well.
And how important, Steve, is data sharing? Because, is this about private companies coming up with modelling to, sell their services to other companies and to governments and say, here you go, if you buy our services, we can tell you how to protect yourself from climate change and how to insure? Or is it about, does this information need to be public so that everyone can prepare?
It's a great question. Everything, of course, starts off with the quality of data. These models output, the quality of the output is only as good as the quality of the data that's being input into it. Now, I know Emily and I have talked about this before, but in the U.S., just in terms of hazard data, we tend to be quite spoiled from NOAA. They have a really robust, freely available data set. But when we're trying to look at areas which tend to be the most vulnerable, areas, say, parts of Asia, Latin America, Africa, where we know that the climate change impacts are going to be the most pronounced, that's where we actually have the least amount of data. So trying to have more private and public sector engagement, trying to identify different types of data that we can identify and use. Of course, free is best, because that means everyone's going to be able to use it. More of a open, clear box approach is certainly preferred. But I think that I'm optimistic in terms of what we've seen. There's definitely a recognition that we have a long way to go, and there's a lot of momentum to try to make as much data available as possible to start seeing these solutions coming forward, where we're really trying to help people, because that's the fundamental nature of insurance, right? You're trying to help people get back on their feet, and if we can help them prepare ahead of time to mitigate that risk, that's really important. And of course, CAT modeling is certainly one important tool that can be used to help with that.
Perhaps I can just add on to that. So one of the things that we're very much trying to do at the moment is to look at an ever-increased granularity at climate risk information, because that's ultimately what's critical for decision makers of any type, whether that's in the insurance sector or elsewhere. And there are two components of that. First of all, there's understanding the meteorological risk, if you like, at a local level. And what we're doing there increasingly is combining together climate model information, physics-based climate model information, together with the wealth of data sets that there are of what historic conditions have been, combining those together using AI machine learning approaches to increase the granularity of the meteorological risk information. But then, as Steve said, the additional factor is the vulnerability. And so how can we also incorporate in data around the vulnerability? And in both instances, both in terms of the meteorological data and any information that we might have that to assess the vulnerability, then having those data sets being open and accessible is absolutely critical to us to be able to produce that information. And then, of course, once we have produced that risk information, then we want to, at least from the academic perspective, make that as available as possible to anybody who would be wanting to base decisions on it. And there's, I think, a really critical thing there is that just making it publicly available doesn't necessarily make it accessible. So how can we provide that information to, let's say people in particularly vulnerable countries who are wanting to build, greater resilience to the impacts of climate change? How can we provide that information in a way that is genuinely accessible to those people who are going to be making decisions?
And are you seeing a pathway to, for example, people being able to have an app on their phone where they can just get it very easily and understand what it is, or are we still a long way away from that kind of?
Well, I mean, that would, I think we currently are some way away from that, but the technology is there in order to be able to do that. The other component that's critically important, I think, is, and Steve and I have talked about this before, is around somehow providing some kind of quality assurances or sort of certification, if you like, standards on what that climate risk information is, and being able to trace the provenance of the data that's gone into it, and indeed the methodologies that have been used in order to produce that, because there is uncertainty associated with any of these future projections, and being able to properly characterise that uncertainty is absolutely essential if you're going to be making robust decisions on the basis of that information.
So we're talking about future projections. Over the river, there's 197 countries negotiating climate change, some kind of policies to try and mitigate climate change and adapt. One of the big issues is around loss and damage, and this kind of term compensation, which I'm not allowed to say. It's nobody's fault, but it's about looking forward, but also about looking back. And I know often when, for example, there's floods in Germany, we might say, well, was that caused by climate change, or would it have happened anyway? And that's obviously going to be a question for the insurance industry as well. So how is the science evolving there, and the data evolving, so that we're able to look back and say that's caused by climate change, or it would have happened anyway?
Yes, well, that is one. I mean, that in particular is one area where the science has advanced a lot over the last 5 years, since Paris, in fact, is our ability to take an extreme weather event that has occurred and ask the question: has there been an increase in risk of that sort of extreme weather event, whether it's a heat wave or a flood event, as a consequence of the climate change to date, attribution studies. And that's an area where there's been a significant advance over the last 5 years in terms of the science, such that routinely now, every time there's an extreme weather event that occurs around the world, the very rapid response in terms of scientifically then making exactly that kind of assessment. And I think that's been really important in terms of raising the level of understanding of the risk that we're already facing today at whatever we are, 1.1 degree of global average warming.
So, Steve, what more does the insurance industry need in terms of modelling to be able to process what it is they need to be able to provide the right insurance and to make the uninsurable insurable?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we've touched upon it, more data. I mean, there's always a need for more. As Emily was saying, the granularity of the data certainly is going to be increasingly important as we're trying to nail down to an asset location in terms of what the potential risk may look like in the future. Just touching base on what you were just talking about in terms of what we need. I mean, in terms of mapping, I mean, there's a huge opportunity, not just for the public sector, but for the private sector to really come out with strong maps to help clearly identify where we expect changes to be seen on the various perils. And then, the big challenge, of course, is not just the attribution component of these events, but also trying to quantify, what the climate change impact is. And that's difficult to do just in the real time, but trying to do that in the future is even more difficult. So I think, using data, having more granular data, improving the computational power of the machines that are actually running these simulations, I think is going to be a really important next step forward as we really try to get a better handle on what the risk looks like. And more importantly, try to communicate what that uncertainty is. I know Emily has mentioned it a few times. The uncertainty component of this is really important because we know there is certain absolutes that we understand in terms of how different perils are behaving, but there's still quite a bit of uncertainty in terms of what precisely we're going to be seeing, not just in the near term, but the long term, and then trying to make it easily digestible for really understand what the risk is at their individual location. Because if we're talking about people, what could be seen in terms of at the national level, but people really know what it's going to be like at their own home. So as the data improves and we're able to really nail down a bit more with the granularity on the computational power, I think we might be able to get there. So I'm quite optimistic.
And I think what Steve's saying just there is really important for exactly the discussions that are happening across the river in terms of the wider negotiations, because in terms of policymakers, it's exactly the same. It's that information at a more granular level. What's really going to be happening to the households of citizens in their countries? What is the risk into the future? And we perhaps, there's been so much of a focus on global average temperature that often that risk assessment is missed. And if we could bring the risk assessment framework, the sort of framework that insurers are used to using, into the negotiations, then I think it would give something much more tangible to increase that sense of ambition, the need of urgency, because that's where it's really hitting the lives and livelihoods of people around the world at a local level, and in terms of extreme events. And there's both aspects of it. It is both about raising ambition in terms of mitigation, but also raising ambition in terms of adaptation, because these are the risks that we need to be building resilience to.
And are countries coming to you increasingly looking for that information?
I think, absolutely, and I think that one of the key things that I think Steve said is how can we provide that information is in as clear and understandable way as possible. So how can we provide, for example, a really concise but tailored risk assessment for governments of countries around the world, for example, and if we could do that in a really concise way, then I think that it would make what sometimes seems as being a global problem that's difficult to really understand how it relates to any individual or any individual country much more tangible.
But how granular could we get? Because when I was coming in through security this morning, I was talking to somebody from the Ugandan delegation, and they work on capacity building. And I had to confess, I didn't know what capacity building was. And she explained to me that it was all about actually educating people locally on the ground about what climate change is, and explaining to them why it matters, how they can mitigate, and how they can adapt to it. So when we're talking about, for example, small-scale farmers, will we be able to get the information to them? Because it's all very well sort of getting it to the governments, and they can, they've got the brains who can process it. But maybe, if there's someone who's out in the field, 10 hours a day, they just need to know.
This is my point about it. The information needs to be accessible. So we need, as you say, we need to be creating information that we can then be putting in the hands of exactly those farmers. There are some, really amazing examples of businesses that are starting up that are providing exactly that, using technology to both connect smallholder farmers with markets on the one hand, and with the data that can be helping to inform them to be more resilient and more sustainable in terms of their farming practices. And so, if we can encourage more of that sort of technology and those sort of technological solutions, then I think it's a real opportunity for providing additional benefit.
There must be some cool small companies starting up that are developing these this kind of service. Obviously, your company as well. But are there any Anything that's really excited you recently that you've seen coming out of Silicon Valley or maybe Silicon Roundabout in London?
I mean, I think across the board, actually, there's a huge opportunity for using digital technologies to address some of these issues. And you mentioned capacity building, and there's clearly a really significant need for actually increasing capacity in terms of digital skills in order to be able to, but both develop and use the data that's coming out from those sort of companies.
Steve, I want to ask you about the pandemic, because we can't get away from it. How has the pandemic changed people's views on climate modelling?
Well, I think Emily referenced it off the top around the whole interconnectedness of our global economy and really everything in terms of how we continue to see these large-scale disasters happening concurrently at the same time, and how that leads to massive disruption to daily life. We're seeing it today with the global supply chain issues. So I think the big challenge with climate modeling is that we can't just focus on the physical damage risk at the point of where an event may occur. You have to be assuming that, say, a factory is damaged in, say, Japan, for instance. If that facility goes down, they're not able to transfer, their goods to another facility in Cambodia, and then that can't get to someplace in Europe or the US. So it leads to this massive chain reaction. So we have to start thinking about the risk of climate change, not just from the physical standpoint, but also the secondary and tertiary perspective as well. So there's certainly a lot of opportunity there to try to get a better handle on the bigger picture of what climate change is going to look like. And then there's, of course, all the other additional components around the socioeconomics, even geopolitical concerns. So there's really a lot of opportunity there, and really trying to help people get a better and a clearer view in terms of what the broader risk is going to look like.
So coming to the close of our session now, Emily, do you have any final words?
Well, actually, I mean, just picking up on the point that Steve just made there, supply chain risk, that is the big thing that has been really highlighted by the pandemic, and is critical to understand in the context of climate change as well.
Absolutely. We've seen huge disruption. I think we'll continue to for quite some time. Well, thank you so much to my guests, Emily, Shuckburgh and Mark. And thanks everyone for joining us.